The term gunfighter is used heavily in discussions of the Wild West. This is despite the word being a general phrase meant to describe a number of professions and lifestyles on the western frontier. Back in the Old West, gunfighter could mean ranchers and cowboy archetypes you see in artistic representations of the time period. It could also relate to the polar opposites. Both lawmen and outlaws alike were forms of gunfighters, always armed and ready for a show, either for the greater good or the selfish bad. Gunfighters were also men, and sometimes women, who were otherwise members of everyday industries, such as farmers or teamsters, which were the drivers of the wagons, stagecoaches, and after the turn of the 20th century, automobiles. Even folks stuck with the labels of con man and gambler were referred to generally as gunfighters, people who could defend themselves when their vice of choice led them into murkier waters. Of all the professions spanning all the industries, the most fascinating subgroup of gunfighters was the bounty hunters, men dispatched by both the government and powerful entities who venture out across the land in search of a man or woman who owes someone else money or other goods. While bounty hunting wasn't as popular a career as many Hollywood films and tales of the Wild West would suggest, it was a way for some of the most experienced and isolated gunfighters to make a living, while using their talents to the best of their abilities. To cover these intriguing and incendiary figures of Western frontier lore, here's the first in our series of both famous and infamous bounty hunters, starting with the legendary Texas Ranger and bounty hunter, John Riley Duncan. John Riley Duncan, nicknamed Jack by his family and closest confidants, was born on September 25, 1850, to James and Catherine Duncan. The family resided in north-central Kentucky, where John was ultimately born. He was one of a few boys, all brothers, who grew up conducting hard work on the family farm. Their dedication to the family ranch was only magnified after 1861, when John was just 10 years old. The Duncan patriarch, James Duncan, was called to serve in the Confederate Army in the American Civil War. Kentucky fell on the side of the rebellion, and John and his brothers were too young to join their father. Instead, they became important cogs to their north-central Kentucky community, an endearment with the region that would benefit John and company into the post-war years. After James Duncan returned from the war in 1865, he and his boys hunkered down to make a better life for themselves in a rebuilding South. Over the next 5 years, the Duncan family invested in various small businesses, ranging from general stores and food services to blacksmiths and cobblers. One year, John Duncan himself attempted to start a saddler's shop, repairing the saddles of returning military men and aspiring Confederates turned cowboys. Unfortunately for the family, neither the saddler shop or any of the other business ventures panned out. The rest of north-central Kentucky didn't have much to offer in terms of a new way of life either, and the Duncans were left directionless. That is until James and Catherine decided it was time to finally say goodbye to the little farming community they had been welcomed into, and journey west like so many others had done before them. While the days of dangerous wagon trains and manifest destiny weren't quite what they were at the beginning of the 19th century, it was still no picnic attempting to traverse the long journey out west. The Duncans were up to the task now, however, with the three boys now grown into young adult men, able to take on the heavy lifting themselves. In the early 1870s, the Duncan clan completed their trek to northeast Texas and settled near Dallas. Dallas treated John and his family much better than the rebuilt towns of rural Kentucky. At the time, it was a booming industrial town seeing unparalleled growth with the completion of the railroads heading further west. In another 5 years, the Duncan family fortune had reversed for the best, with James and his son John taking on honest work as butchers. One of the other Duncan brothers made his stake to claim in the land management business. All was well by 1875. the Duncan's clan's assimilation into Dallas nearly complete. Away from their residence, though, the city's population had ballooned to nearly 10,000. And with the increase in people came the increase in conflicts. And with conflict on the western frontier, only one thing could follow. With an increase in conflict came an increase in crime. And an increase in crime could only mean additional Texas lawmen were needed. When John Duncan first joined the Dallas police force, the unit only comprised 10 or so men, and only a percentage of them had any history in the military or gunfighting or other relevant industry. As a result, John's lack of a gunfighting background didn't deter the Dallas police superiors from giving the kid from Kentucky a chance to join ranks in October of 1876 and make a positive impact on the community. At first, John stuck with fairly easy yet monotonous police work. During the time period, Dallas and many other flourishing industry cities along the frontier dealt with an out-of-control feral dog endemic. John was one of the lucky police officers tasked with rounding up the feral dogs and either keeping them out of local businesses by sheltering them or exterminating them. It wasn't humane, but at the time, the folks of Dallas had no other choice, as it was creating sanitary and safety issues across town. After John had shown his ability to adjust on the fly and handle menial jobs with grace, he was ordered to move on from the feral dogs for a while, and instead focus on the human element of Dallas. Rather, John was instead tasked with arresting disorderly drunks and small-time petty thieves who used the night as their cloak into villainy. Within 6 short months, John went from a former butcher to amateur beat cop to respected lawman of Dallas, Texas. Many fellow officers and citizens alike applauded John for his hard work despite the tedious, thankless nature his tasks usually came with. Luckily for John, these feelings extended well beyond the confines of Dallas and deeper into the Lone Star State. It just so happened that at around the same time in the spring of 1877, Texas officials were attempting to fry a much bigger fish, and John Riley Duncan was the perfect recruit to join the operation. In the early 1870s, an infamous outlaw of the Old West by the name of John Wesley Hardin, or Wes Hardin for short, heavily involved himself with the Sutton-Taylor feud. The dual family conflict, a popular such event of the time period, was a feud between state lawmen and local lawmen of South Central Texas, with lifelong Texan gunfighter Wes Hardin mixed up on the side of the Taylor family, after running from the law since he was a boy. Little Arkansas, as they came to know him, Wes Hardin pushed the top Texas officials both before and after the Sutton-Taylor feud. He was notorious for his outlandish stories and unhinged demeanor, and always seemed to slip through long-term incarceration whenever the moment was imminent. Wes Hardin's ultimate downfall was eventually spurred on May 26, 1874, in a small city called Comanche, Texas. He was about to have a drink with the popular sheriff of Brown County at the time, Charles Webb, when he double-crossed Webb and killed him in a gunfight. It's long been argued why Hardin shot Webb, despite the latter's claim he had no intention of arresting the Texan outlaw that day, despite his lengthy list of crimes. Some believe he was pulling out an arrest warrant for one of the Taylor family criminals a part of Hardin's posse, and Hardin mistook it for a gun, taking out his own weapon and starting the shootout. In the aftermath, Hardin escaped while the rest of his family and cohorts either went into hiding or were put into protective custody. When the leader of the Sutton family faction was murdered the following year, Hardin's time free from capture was coming to a swift close. In January of 1875, the governor of Texas at the time, Richard B. Hubbard, was given authorization by the state legislature to offer any lawman a whopping $4,000 for the arrest of Wes Hardin. Many state and local authorities tried their hand at tracking down Hardin, but nobody had the connections needed to pinpoint his location in the open, rural plains of Texas. That is, except for one lawman, who was brand new to the profession, but a potential valuable piece to the Wes Hardin puzzle, John Riley Duncan. After impressing the folks of Dallas for months and collecting a vast array of arrests and other achievements while on the police force, John's superiors gathered intel on the Texas Rangers' pursuit of Hardin. The Rangers had been visiting other small locales around the area, hoping to find fellow lawmen who might lend a hand in finding wanted outlaws. A few Dallas officials remembered John and his family's presence in Northeast Texas, and how the butcher-turned-officer was both friendly and familiar with the state's smaller settlements. Thus, in July 1877, John Duncan met with the high-ranking members of the Texas Rangers in a meeting organized by his superiors. While John didn't know much about bounty hunting, which was a term not yet used by the general public, he didn't need much persuasion to take on the Rangers' assignment. Afterwards, John began his endeavor that now seems like it was ripped straight from a Hollywood Western rather than the Western frontier itself. He was tasked with going undercover and collecting information in Gonzales County, Texas, where a bulk of Hardin's family and his wife's family lived. John hunkered down in Gonzales County for a couple of weeks, maintaining his disguise so as to not draw suspicious eyes. Before long, he was monitoring the Postal Service activities happening in and around the extended Hardin family residences. This would later prove to be his first clue. One day, John Duncan intercepted an envelope marked for Wes Hardin's father-in-law. Inside was a letter, written by Joshua Brown Bowen, Wes Hardin's brother-in-law. In the letter, Brown wrote that Hardin had recently been using a small farming town near the border of Alabama and Florida as his safe house, hiding under the alias of James W. Swain. After procuring a bit more intel, John informed his fellow Texas Rangers of his discovery. His supervisors, including Lieutenant John Barkley Armstrong, applauded his work and dispatched him to southeastern Alabama, where his undercover work would progress. It didn't take long for John to uncover the next clue. Just off the Gulf Coast in Pensacola, Florida, Wes Hardin was detected in the midst of a major gambling spree, unaware that the Texas Rangers were hot on his trail. Knowing they didn't have all the time in the world to act, however, John Duncan and the Ranger Company connected with the local authorities to fill them in on Wes Hardin-led plans. Gaining the help of the railroad officials and a longtime Florida judge, the newly founded posse set up an ambush at a Pensacola rail yard. On the 24th of August, 1877, the crew of lawmen set up their posts around inconspicuous corners of the rail yard, as well as inside the actual train car in question. It was there the railroad operator would intentionally smoke out the car withholding Hardin, and force him into a crowd of Rangers. As soon as the smoke started, however, Hardin knew something was amiss and tried to draw his gun, a .44 Colt pistol at the time. He didn't get it far, however, as the handgun got stuck in his suspenders. The undercover officers on board leapt up and started a melee with the wanted outlaw, alongside the sidekicks he dragged along with him, and rendered the gun useless. After a few minutes of fistfighting and wrestling down the criminals afoot, the aforementioned Lieutenant Armstrong knocked Hardin unconscious, after which he was promptly arrested. One of his cohorts, Jim Mann, was shot and killed, while the rest of the gang joined Hardin in prison. The longtime Texas outlaw was finally behind bars, where he would remain for the next 17 years. Back in Northeast Texas, John Duncan was seen as a hero for orchestrating such a successful yet dangerous undercover mission, taking down one of the Lone Star State's most notorious bad guys. By the time the dust settled and John received that $4,000 reward from Governor Hubbard, however, his commitment to the Texas Rangers waned. As Lieutenant Armstrong attempted to bring him into the fold full-time, John had other ideas. After a short 4-month career with the Rangers, John decided to pursue bounty hunting for the rest of his working life. The reward was too good to settle for chump change that came with state law enforcement. He may have also fallen in love with the adrenaline-filled lifestyle of hunting down criminals by his lonesome, without the pressure of the law nipping at his heels. Nevertheless, John Duncan pressed forward into the dark and seedy sides of the greater Dallas, Texas community. Feral dog assignments quickly became bounties for hardened, violent strangers, taking the former butcher through all sorts of crumbling gambling halls, scandalous brothels, and his fair share of saloons soaked in controversy. In one such instance, John was shot by a sex worker while undercover on February 9, 1878. The circumstances surrounding the incident have always remained a mystery, but it was so sudden and shocking to the bounty hunter, he almost lost his life. When a doctor attempted to find the bullet in the days after the shooting, they were unable to remove it from John's body, leading to lead poisoning years later. Due to the lead, John underwent an emergency tracheotomy, otherwise he would perish. As a result, the bounty hunter received a breathing tube made of silver to be inserted into his trachea. While his breathing and voice were forever altered by the procedure, it still didn't thwart his passion for bounty hunting, nor did it diminish his skill. By 1895, John Duncan had collected at least 20 other bounties after claiming the reward on West Hardin. Altogether, these bounties totaled over $12,000 in prize money, or about $425,000 when adjusted for inflation. It might not seem like much when spread over an 18-year career, but John was only 45 when he retired from bounty hunting. The landscape of the law was rapidly changing both in Texas and throughout the rest of the frontier, and bounty hunters were no longer relied on for rounding up the slippery scoundrels that still roamed the streets. Vigilante justice wasn't looked on as kindly, or rather, officials could no longer turn the other cheek. Major reform took the bounty hunting profession by storm, and many either rejoined local authorities or searched for new sectors popping up as cities' populations grew. John Duncan was of the latter group, finding employment in areas such as carpentry and security for the Corps of Engineers. For a time, he was the head inspector at Dallas Sanitation, the perfect job to hold while he helped raise 4 children with his wife, Emma Jane Bowles. The two had married back in October of 1884, while John was still a bounty hunter. In a cruel twist of fate, John Duncan's revering life spent chasing criminals and outlawing outlaws came to a tragic end on November 16, 1911. John, who was 61 at the time, crashed his brush runabout south of Dallas and died from his injuries. It is unknown what exactly caused the death, but many believe his breathing tube installed from the tracheotomy had been dislodged and lost in the crash. If anything, it was a sad way for a man of such legend to go by. Regardless, it's hard to read about the life and legacy of the former butcher turned bounty hunter and not feel like he helped define the lifestyle at large. He embodied so much of what it meant to go against the grain of the Old West and take down outlaws. He was intelligent but humble, well-traveled yet a family man, courageous without pride, and above all, willing to go the extra mile and outplay his rivals. It's why there were double-digit names on the list he crossed off for good in 1895. John Riley Duncan was one hell of a good bounty hunter, and his capture of West Hardin and the exploits that followed sure do make one hell of a good story. Much like the wild, wild West itself.